It is 10:30, so if you could take your seats, we're going to get started. And Senator Holscher, she is on her way. She sent a message saying she's running a little bit late. We're going to go ahead and get started, though. I am Ashley Fick. I'm the Civic Engagement Librarian for Johnson County Library. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Saturday morning to be here. We appreciate it. Thank you to our legislators for doing the same. So just a couple pieces of housekeeping before we get started. On your seats, there are note cards. Those note cards are for how you will submit your questions. So once you have a question, hold it up. Somebody will be around to collect it. Even throughout the program, we'll be collecting, so hold it up if you've got one. And if you need another note card, there are plenty. We have hundreds of note cards, so you can submit as many as you would like. If you are watching online, you can submit your questions online and through the description. There's a form. And with that, just a couple other rules. Please do not shout out throughout the program. If you have a clarifying question, submit it on a note card. If you're upset with something a legislator says, there are sheets on your chair that say follow up. It has all their contact information. Please follow up with them. They want to hear from you. That's why they're here. And then refrain from clapping. That also helps us get to as many questions as possible. And definitely no booing. I'm sure nobody would do that, but that's like a big no-no. All right. So with that, we're going to get started. Each legislator is going to have 3 minutes to talk about what's going on in Topeka. And we're going to start with Senator Sykes and just move down the line.
All right. Good morning. I am Senator Dinah Sykes. I serve and represent the 21st District, which is Lenexa, Overland Park, Shawnee, Merriam, and Olathe, thanks to redistricting. I also have the privilege of serving as Minority Leader in the Senate. I am ranking on education, and that's really my only standing committee that I meet daily because of the leadership duties. But just an update on the Senate, and I know we have several senators. This week, we did work 3 bills. 2 of them, one was naming 69 Highway, not controversial, and the other one was approving that Dickinson County could put it to the voters for a tax increase or something. The other one was our budget. So as all of you know, that our constitutional duty is that we have to pass a budget. I would say, so this is my second term in the Senate. Under our previous president, the budget was really exclusive to the Ways and Means Committee. They were the ones who were looking at all of the subcommittees, all those different budgets, and then they passed it. So it was just those members. There were 9 members at the time. Our current Senate president decided to split that out. So Ways and Means, they're the ones who pass the final budget to the Senate, but each committee, so if it has to do with agriculture, they send that agricultural sub-budget to the Agricultural Committee. Education came to education. So they divided it out, which I thought was a really good way because, you know, we are the committees that are dealing with those individual issues and more of the experts on those. So that is how it has happened for the last 2 years. This year, all of those committees did that work. And then all of a sudden, the Ways and Means decided that they did not like what those subcommittees did, so they took out all of the recommendations and stripped about $400 million in recommendations from those budgets that committees had decided. So it's really a bare bones budget. Took out special education funding. I know there was a lot of conversation at the beginning of the session. The governor had a recommendation for putting $500 million into our rainy day fund. Republicans at the time, their suggestion was $1 billion, and kind of that compromise was 0. So we will actually have final action on the budget on Monday to vote for that, but it is not a very good budget, and honestly, it was stripped to pay for tax bills that have passed the Senate. So I look forward to your questions.
Good morning. I'm Representative Lindsay Vaughn. I represent the 22nd District, which is this district. So welcome to the 22nd. The district goes from 79th to 99th and then Metcalf to Schweitzer, so pretty compact. And I am lucky to serve as the ranking member of the House Water Committee, so I deal a lot with environmental issues in the legislature. I've been very focused on 2 water bills that we've proposed this session that I can talk a little bit more about. And then I've also been very focused on following up with the Keystone oil spill that happened in Washington, Kansas, and holding TC Energy accountable for the cleanup and remediation and then follow-up actions after that spill. So those are kind of my focus areas. I also serve on Health and Human Services Committee, and while that committee started out pretty non-controversial, we have since seen a number of really bad bills, in my opinion. So, I can talk more about that as well. And then my last committee is Judiciary, and I'm new to that committee this year, and that's been wonderful. In terms of what we've been doing this week, we have seen a number of big bills come through. One of those was Senate Bill 83, which is the voucher bill, which would allow public dollars to be used for private schools. Representative Ousley serves on the K-12 committee, so I'll leave that to him to talk more about that. We came really close to defeating that on the floor, but fell just short. So that did pass out of the House, and I think many of us will be hoping for a veto on that, in which case we would hypothetically have the votes to sustain that veto. Another bill we worked this week, we are in the process of discussing legislative pay, which is sometimes an awkward thing to talk about, but I think for a lot of young people and people from underrepresented backgrounds that serve in the legislature, it's an important conversation to have. We, have had some people have done the math, and for some folks, they're losing money doing this job. So it makes it really hard for young people to make it sustainable, and working people to make it sustainable in the long term. So what we passed out of the House is just the formation of a nonpartisan commission where they'll study the issue and they'll decide how does the Kansas legislative pay compare to states and surrounding areas who also have a part-time legislature. So we go to Topeka full-time for about 5 months of the year. So how do similar legislatures, what does their pay structure look like? And then next year, we'll have to decide based on their recommendations whether to implement that. So that's an update. And then one fun bipartisan thing we did this week is approve the formation of a new state park called Portland Lehigh State Park outside of Iola, Kansas. So I thought that was a great thing we did. And that's my update for today. So happy to answer questions as well.
Great. And I'm Senator Ethan Corson. I represent Northeast Johnson County, all are part of 10 cities there. I go from 47th Street out to 95th Street and then state line to a little bit west of Metcalf. I serve as the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee and the Senate Transportation Committee. I'm also a member of the Senate Utilities Committee, the Senate Tax Committee, and the Legislative Post-Audit Committee. I want to pick up where, because it's very fresh on my mind, and I think as we head into the home stretch, a really important issue, I want to pick up where Senator Sykes left off, talking about the budget, which we're going to be voting on Monday. And obviously, this is, I think, one of the most important things, if not the most important thing that we do every legislative session. And there's so much sort of coverage about the individual crazy bills that are introduced, but at the end of the day, the budget is really one of the most important things for every session. So I will not be voting for the budget on Monday, and I've got kind of a top 5 list of reasons why I'm not going to be supporting the budget. Number one is because of all the tax cuts, which mostly go to the wealthy. The budget's not sustainable. So within a couple years, we're going to take what's a $2.3 billion surplus, and this budget, if it was enacted, would have us in a deficit of $50 million within 2 years because of all the tax cuts. Number two, it doesn't include Medicaid expansion. We're actually giving up money to not expand Medicaid. So really crazy that we're not doing that. It's really hard for me to vote for that budget without that in there. Doesn't include any increased funding for special education. A huge problem for Shawnee Mission School District, which I represent, for all the other school districts in Johnson County, and for school districts across the state. Doesn't include, the governor proposed setting up a $220 million matching fund so our cities and counties could really access the most possible federal funds from the bipartisan infrastructure law. it gets rid of that $220 million. Again, part of the reason is because of the massive tax cuts that we passed earlier in the session. And then finally, it doesn't include any money for our rainy day fund. So, we could be heading into a recession at some point. It is really important, especially at a time of surplus, that we're putting money away for our rainy day fund. So I think it's really irresponsible for us to have a budget that doesn't include any money for the rainy day fund, especially at a time when we have such a budget surplus. So I hope you all pay attention to the rest of the budget process as it works its way through, because again, I think that's probably one of the most important things that will come out of this entire session. So thanks for having me, and thanks for being here.
Good morning. My name is Jarrod Ousley. I represent House District 24, just to the north of here. Just to start where Senator Corson left off, I'm serving on the Appropriations Committee in the House this year for the first time, and I think we'll put together our budget on Tuesday. So it sounds like the Senate's ahead of us. I don't have comment on the House's position on the budget just yet. Stay tuned on that one. We'll have more update at a later date and time, I'm sure. For 6 years, I served as a ranking member on Children and Seniors in the House. Last year, the year before, I was appointed to the Johnson County Commission on Aging. And then this year, the House kind of did some reorganization of committee structures, and it's now the Child Welfare and Foster Care Oversight that I'm the ranking member of, and I no longer deal with senior issues in that committee. And then as Representative Vaughn mentioned, I serve on the K-12 budget. So it's kind of interesting to hear from senators. People think we discuss a lot between House members and senators while we're in session in the same building, and that's really not true. They kind of keep on their side of the rotunda. They're doing their thing. We're over here, and until later in session when we're ironing out things, we really don't know. So that's actually the first I've heard that the Senate created budget subcommittees. And K-12 budget being one of our subcommittees in the House, dealing with half of our state budget, I was excited to get on appropriations because for the last 4 or 5 years, since the rewriting of our school formula to address the Gannon decision, the K-12 budget committee has kind of been a standalone committee, and that's what's got us to the point of you all hearing about Senate Bill 83, where they tie a voucher system to, $590 million worth of special education funding coming to the state. Typically, an appropriations bill is appropriations and a policy bill is policy. And because they've left that chunk of our appropriations out of our appropriations committee, there are less eyes on it, less votes to get it out of committee, and to the chair's discretion to blend that policy and appropriations in there. So I've tried in committee on appropriations to bring that back into the process that the rest of the state budget follows when it's going through the House. And we were unsuccessful on that, but I'm sure we can talk more about that later. The other thing I think that's kind of big news is the governor's veto on the transgender athletes bill. So I'm happy to discuss that with you all. And then the mention on Medicaid expansion. Not only are we paying to not expand Medicaid, but due to the pandemic, there were Medicaid applicants that wouldn't have been eligible otherwise than the state of emergency, and that winding down is going to start like tomorrow, I think in June. But it's going to put about 120,000 Kansans off of Medicaid that are currently covered, and I hope that everybody's aware of that as well. Thank you.
All right, there we go. Good morning. I'm State Senator Cindy Holscher. Thank you all for being here. My apologies for running a few minutes late. I usually seem to have like several events stacked up on every weekend, trying to make sure I'm getting out to speak with different individuals and different groups. So thank you for having me. It's been an interesting week. Well, it's been an interesting session, to say the least, as we have several issues that are very important we need to be working on the legislature. But unfortunately, the bulk of our time seems to be devoted to things that aren't exactly issues in Kansas. Coming up actually, I'm going to go back for just a second. This past week in Fed and State, we did have a, quote, medicinal cannabis hearing. For those of you who have been interested in that issue, about 2 weeks ago, there was an informational hearing, which was 2 days of opponents only. And that was it. No bill discussed, no bill worked, nothing from supporters or no other information was shared during that 2-day time period. So a number of us, myself included, raised the issue that no matter what the topic, we should hear from both sides as well as neutrals and have an open, transparent process. So this past week, there was then a hearing on a particular bill that is in the Senate for medicinal cannabis. It was a 2-day hearing with 1 day devoted to supporters as well as neutral, and then another day devoted to opponents. So, and all opponents got 3 days worth of time to share testimony and their thoughts. In the end, what happened is action was taken on that bill, and essentially a motion was made to table it. And that may sound kind of innocuous in the respect that, okay, tabling it, maybe they will take the bill up later. But essentially, when you table a bill in committee, it can't be touched by that committee again. So that bill cannot have action in committee. So if we are to do anything on that topic this year, it has to be on the floor or through another bill, which would mean another hearing process, et cetera. So that's been kind of an interesting navigation process, to say the least, on that topic. Our public health care committee that I serve on has had a number of issues. Again, we have spent a lot of time dedicated to things that aren't necessarily issues in Kansas. Informational hearings devoted to, quote, experts on topics in regard to vaccines, and some of those experts have been discredited. So that's concerning, the amount of time that's been given to misinformation. We do have some concerning bills coming up this week. SB 315 would allow ideological exemptions for vaccines for school-age children. So that is going to be heard in healthcare this week. Lots of other bills going on. Obviously, like the bulk of us here, I have a lot of focus on ensuring that we get education funded, that we get special ed funded, because that is so critically important. And I will mention I have a bill that is supposed to have a hearing this week. SB 95, which has been turned into SB 317, which would help victims of childhood sexual violence, because our statute of limitations in Kansas is very limited. And as a result, that means that people who preyed upon children who are now adults are likely still out there on the streets because their cases have never come forward. So I brought this visual to help illustrate some of the background with that bill. So happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Joco residents recently received their tax statements with increased property valuations across the board. What comments do you have for our citizens on fixed incomes who do not have the funds to pay for these increased taxes?
So I will start. I know this is an issue, and part of it, conversations with the governor, we were looking at, especially those fixed incomes. I'm dealing with Social Security. Currently, we have that cliff. So if you make $75,001, then you're taxed on all of that. She had a proposal that would kind of ease that cliff. So that is an issue. We also have some legislation exempting part of the 20 mills for our education. I think it's at 40. So the first 40,000 of your house is exempt from that. So there are some discussions about that that we can do. There's also legislation that's been introduced on constitutional amendments, but really, I think the focus of me is trying to figure out how to get more of those tax dollars from Social Security for special seniors.
Yeah, thank you. So I can, in coordination with Representative Ousley, talk a little bit about the House proposals to help lower property taxes. So our caucus put together a 3-bill proposal in order to do that. One, as Representative Sykes mentioned, was the raising the exemption on the mill levy. So I think currently it's 40,000. I think the discussion was either 55 or 60,000. So that first 60,000 of your house value would be exempted from that mill levy. So that's something that we've been talking about that has not yet received a hearing in the House. The other thing we talked about was restoring the ad valorem fund. So in the past, there's been an ad valorem where the state contributed dollars to counties and municipalities to help offset the cost of reducing property tax rates at the local level. So that fund hasn't been fully funded for a number of years. So part of the conversation is for 20 years, our county commissioner says. So it's been a long time. So that's part of the discussion. Can we restore that funding to help our local communities offset that cost? And then I think the last proposal was changing, it was the constitutional change.
It's the percentage on that constitutional. I don't know the numbers. But.
Yeah, I'm not sure on the numbers either, but yeah, it was a constitutional change to the percentage of, yeah. I'm not as familiar with that one, so if someone else has more info, would encourage them to share. But so I know, a lot of the property tax valuation happens at the local level, but we can do stuff at the state level to help offset that cost, because I know, the average this year was a 12% increase, which is a huge burden for a lot of people, especially on a fixed income. So finding ways as a state that we can not only address property taxes, but to address the rising costs of living in Johnson County in general, including addressing Social Security, and then eliminating the food sales tax immediately is something that we're trying to get done this year, and doing some offsetting of those costs with smart tax policy.
One of the things I would mention, one of the things I talked to my colleagues, especially on the other side of the aisle on the Senate Tax Committee about, is how we continue to enact policies that really continue to push a larger and larger percentage of the tax burden onto our residential property owners. And so what I mean by that specifically was, instead of just taking the food sales tax off at the state level, our bill takes it off also at the local level. And the challenge with that is, for many of the cities that I represent, that's a significant part of their income. That's how they pay for a lot of the social services they provide. That's how they do a lot of the infrastructure services. That's how they provide for police, fire, other public safety. And so when you take, for example, that tax off, all you're doing is really pushing that tax burden onto residential property owners. So, for example, if we eliminate the local tax in Roland Park on food, that's $2.2 million. In Prairie Village, that's $713,000. In Overland Park, it's $6 million. And so there's not that amount of services that these cities can just cut. So what we're doing then is pushing the burden onto our residential property owners. We have another bill that I think is really not appropriate, that would eliminate taxes on gyms and fitness centers and country clubs. Well, so if all of those things go off of the tax rolls, who's going to pick up that slack? It's going to be residential property owners. And so I'm just really opposed to these policies that continue to exacerbate what is obviously an existing problem with residential property taxes by narrowing the number of folks and the number of entities that are paying taxes at the local level, and really leaving our municipalities with almost no choice but to raise property taxes. So I'm going to continue to push back against those things, and I would just ask that you pay attention when those things are going through, because again, I think it's just wildly inappropriate to not have some of these entities contributing to the tax base. Thank you.
So I'll be brief with this. And I am happy to see our minority leader in the House addressing the stabilization of the three-legged stool, if you will. If Kansas has always had the three-legged stool of property income and sales tax, there are definitely people in the State House paying attention and realizing that property tax relief has been overlooked for quite some time, oftentimes while we debate income tax. So I'll leave it at that.
How can the homestead tax home value be raised? $350,000 limit is so outdated, it's hurting low-income families bad.
That is one of those bills in a way that we are trying to address that. Unfortunately, sometimes things that are pragmatic are not the path that we like to choose in the legislature. I also want to just comment from Senator Corson was talking about, that ad valorem that hasn't been funded for 20 years. the Senate president proposed a bill, I believe it's 309, and it was trying to keep the locals whole with that sales tax on food portion. And there's a lot of like hoops that the local governments have to jump through to try to get some of that money back if it passes through. But again, I think we're all a little skeptical of it because as we've seen, normally those funds that they have set up to keep locals whole, they may work for like a year, maybe 2 years, and then they pull that money, and then it's just like pulling the rug out from under our locals.
I would just add on the homestead in particular, we are working, we did get, as part of the larger tax package, an increase in the golden years homestead property valuation. So we bumped that up to $595,000. And we raised the income threshold to $100,000. It sort of remains to be seen as part of the larger tax discussion that's going on, whether that will stay in. I'm hopeful that of all the tax pieces that we did pass, many of which I did not support, I really strongly supported that one. And so I'm hopeful that that will remain, because I do think that'll bring a lot more folks into the program, particularly in Johnson County. That should be able to benefit from what I think is a really good structure we set up. So I'm hoping we can keep it at the 595 and raise the income threshold up to 100,000, which is what is currently passed out of the Senate. So that'll be the Senate's position, at least, as we head into the home stretch.
You know, during the course of the session, you get a lot of different bills brought forward that on their own look great, you know, potential tax cuts. And then, you know, it seems like you get a number of legislators who bring forward their pet projects as far as particular cuts they want for their district. And you know, the problem is then when you step back and you look at all of these different programs together, potential cuts, what it does. And I believe when I first entered the legislature in the House at that point, that was about 7 years ago, I think we had the 7th most unfair tax system at that point. And we have made some progress as far as making it a fair system, but we really need an approach that looks at everything because really it just feels like we're doing it all in piecemeal. And that makes it even more difficult because then, like I said, when you back away from all these different programs, sometimes they don't all work together. Sometimes the cuts don't make sense then when you put the pieces of the puzzle back together. So I hope we do get to a point where we have, like I said, more of that global evaluation so that we can get a system that is set up that is more fair to everybody.
The recent voucher bill seems like a good deal from afar. Parent choice, teacher raises, special education funding. All of you voted no. Could you please briefly explain why you voted no?
We could start again with the process that it was a gut and go in K-12 committee of a Senate bill to shorten the process to get this to the governor's desk. We have yet to know the direction it'll head. Tuesday, we'll know if the House accepts the conference committee request from the Senate or if we just go along with it and it gets to the governor's desk. We could go against it on the process of blending policy and appropriations. Again, that had not been done, I think, until 2013 when they snuck the tax credit scholarship for low-income students. It's basically our voucher bill that's in statute today. It had never passed either chamber, and then in a conference committee at like 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning, it got snuck into the entire budget bill for that session. That was taken to court, and it was decided that because there were no appropriations, it was fine. That was part of the legislative process. The special education funding in there, we know we need. That's the first step of a 5-year plan that the State Board of Education came up with last year. I'm happy to see the legislature not arguing that we need to fund special education to our 92% statutory obligation. Earlier this session, we started out by saying, well, some of us started out by saying that we're already funding it to 92%. We don't need to add any new funding. There was no support for that. The math didn't add up. So I'm happy to see we're at least off of that. But again, in order to get that voucher program that had like 257 opponents, I think, in K-12, had 4 or 5 proponents. So not a very well-received piece of legislation that originally had, I want to say, $155 million fiscal note. And that fiscal note is still absent from today's bill. So the 64 votes that got it out of the House are voting on a bill that they have no idea what the cost was. When I ran an amendment on the floor to instead fund 2 years of that 5-year program to fund special education and strip out the voucher piece of it, they challenged it on what we have as a pay-go rule, and that says if you add funding, you got to subtract funding. Well, there was nothing saying that subtracting the education savings account portion of that bill wouldn't have provided the extra $72 million for the second year. The teacher raise is a sticking point because there's no new money in there. It's not a teacher raise. It's an unfunded mandate from the state of Kansas to tell USDs throughout the state that 50% of the funding that we're bound by the Gannon decision and our adjustment to the base state aid per pupil for the CPI, 50% of that now has to go to the classroom, which may not be a problem in some districts, might be a huge problem in other districts. Furthermore, it messes with teacher negotiations with the school districts. So without there being new funding to it, I personally don't agree that it's a raise for teachers. If we really cared about the teachers and we really wanted to give them a raise, we could put that in the bill as well.
Yeah, you know, vouchers, ESAs, educational scholarships, school choice, it all sounds great on face level. And we have school choice. My kids, we live in the Olathe School District. 2 of my kids did not go to the high school that's right down the street from them. They went to a different high school within the district. So there are a lot of parameters already out there as far as school choice. But that's not really what these bills and these programs are about. Essentially what it is, it's a way of shifting money from your local schools to other entities. And a few of the concerns with some of these programs that we've seen is, one, it would allow homeschooling of any type of curriculum, or it would allow potentially in a private school, your tax money, your taxpayer dollars being shifted to an entity or an institution that has no oversight as far as curriculum or academic standards. Whereas if you take a look at the public schools, wow, we have all kinds of standards in place to ensure that students are learning and that there's curriculum in place. Again, there's no oversight as far as how this money is used. And the other thing that happens with a lot of these bills, you know, initially when vouchers first came on the scene, so to speak, in the legislature, we were told, well, this is for lower income students in struggling schools. Every year it gets changed and broadened. And this year, broadened to the extent that we are talking about people making 6 figures that are eligible for, quote, low-income vouchers. So what that means, too, and with some of the other changes to the programs, it means that people who are already sending their children to private schools now get money back, essentially, your taxpayer money. So, and we have some great private schools out there. So the other issue is, too, is so many of them are at capacity. So if you have a child needing to go to a different school or you want them to go to a different school, will your $5,000 voucher even allow that child to go there? Plus, then the parent has to come up with the difference in the tuition. So, like I said, lots of concerns here when in the end, it's basically shuffling your money around to other places, not taxpayer. Yeah, it's taxpayer funds being used for private entities. I wrote an article just the other day that was in the Shawnee Mission Post, kind of illustrating what this does. The other thing that I hear people say is, well, you know, in our area, we don't have private schools and people aren't homeschooling, so kids will continue going to our local public school and it won't hurt us. That's not true, because we only have basically 1 bucket of funding for our schools. So if your taxpayer dollars are going to go to people who are already sending their kids to a private entity, guess what? It's coming out of that bucket, and that leaves less money for our schools, our public schools across the state. So it is a huge concern. We're going to see more of these voucher bills, I'm sure, because every year, what do we have? 5, 6 of them? And in the coming weeks, I'm sure there'll be another push.
Just a little bit about procedure. So the Senate, when we voted on Senate Bill 83, it was a very different bill than what the House voted on Senate Bill 83. So when ours started out, these tax credit scholarships, they were originally for the 100 lowest performing elementary schools. Then every year we've added, expanded that. So, and it was only those lowest performing. Then we said if you received free lunch. Then we expanded it to free and reduced lunch, and then we expanded it to 8th grade. And then this year, on the Senate floor, we expanded it to 400% of poverty. As they talked about, there were provisions in there. So if you had a lady who was a nurse, and then, so one of the family members was a nurse, and the other was an attorney making $500,000, they would qualify for this. So it really, and along those lines, we have 10 SGOs. Those are the scholarship granting organizations. And we did a legislative post-audit because they are supposed to send out 90% of those funds that they receive within 2 years, or actually it's 3 years. And 3 of them have not been doing that. And actually, the way they do their reporting, more could not be applying by the rules that we have. Those schools do not have to accept students if they're LGBTQ, if they have special needs. But if they did accept a student who had special needs, then the public school is still responsible for doing whatever special needs, and then they receive all the funding. We tried to get an amendment on to actually just have some data on how many students are applying for this, how many are allowed to get their, but none of that was accepted. The report that we do get, as I was debating in education committee and talking about these SGOs, they said we're serving 160 students. That's how many kids that we've served. But the report in which they had sent to the legislature said that they had 120 students. So I was asking them, and they were not able to talk about the differences. So if we're going to expand something, we at least need to have the data, the information to know, is this working? They say that all these schools are accredited. They are not accredited to the same standards as our public schools, and there are actually students or schools that are receiving dollars that started an accreditation process that did not finish it. So there is no accountability there. We did try to do a procedural motion in the Senate to basically kill the bill on Wednesday and Thursday because we know that they don't have 21 votes in the Senate, and then because they knew it would kill the bill, and they want to find those pet projects to get to 21 votes or 28, so we will continue to fight that.
I think a lot of the argument has been covered. I just wanted to say, as a proud product of our public schools myself, I went to Blue Valley schools. I strongly believe that everyone in Kansas has the right to a high quality public education. And, I think part of the argument that we're hearing is, we still have underperforming schools. And I think that neglects the part of the argument where we have been chronically underfunding our public schools for a very long time. And we only restored constitutional funding in 2019, I believe it was. So we've only seen the impact of that constitutional funding for a short period of time. So in my mind, the answer is not we need to take these public dollars and put them somewhere else. The answer is we need to make sure we're doing everything we can to invest more in our public schools, more in our special education students, more in this education system that everyone has access to. There are standards for curriculum and for helping everyone achieve success. And so I think that's really important. And the bill that we saw, a lot of the issues were discussed in relation to the contents of this bill specifically. I think another one is that this voucher ESA program is largely experimental, and there were debates about who would actually help administer the program. And there was a floor amendment to change the, and Jarrod, you might help me with this, but the person who essentially reviews that to be the state treasurer. And the state treasurer doesn't really know anything about education. So I think there was just a lot of attempt to kind of piece this together without any real grassroots support, as was mentioned. And I think that just leads to very bad legislation. So I think that's what I would say. Thank you.
I do want to jump back in real quick. Representative Vaughn mentioned something about, some of the talk that's behind the vouchers that are being pushed and everything. After nearly a decade of underfunding our schools because of the Brownback experiment and then COVID, and then just low number of teachers in some areas, we have the highest, I think, number of vacancies currently that we have faced. Please keep in mind that our schools are still very successful. In fact, our ACT scores were one of the few states that held steady through this period of COVID. All other states declined as far as their test scores, but ours in Kansas held steady. We are at an all-time high as far as graduation rates. So we have a lot of successes out there. And obviously, when you look at our schools here in Johnson County, I mean, every day there's a new success story. So I am so very appreciative of the work that our teachers and staff are doing in our schools. And I want you to think about this. When we're talking about this push on these vouchers, there's a huge push in the Capitol, and there are lobbyists there talking about vouchers and saying your schools are failing, which isn't true. But think about this. Who has the money to pay for lobbyists to go to Topeka to try to sell these programs? Is it the rich people, or is it the poor people who they say they're trying to help? So let's think about that. Poor people typically cannot hire lobbyists to go to Topeka and sell these voucher programs, but rich people can. So it's another tax scheme, another way to divert monies back to the pockets of the people who are pretty much in control, that higher income area. So like I said, I think it's just something we need to keep in mind. Who's hiring the lobbyists to sell these programs?
Okay, I'm gonna have us move on. I know that we can talk about this all day. Are the bills regarding special education you support or oppose getting hearings? Are citizens showing up to be heard on these bills, specifically special education parents?
So we have a bill for a special education task force that we had a hearing for in education last week, and there were some people, not a lot of parents showed up, but KNEA was there, Board of Education and stuff. So there is some of that, some lobbying groups, as they're wanting to make sure that they have a special interest on those, so that like a parent would be a part of the task force. So there is some of that. We've had some great days where special ed has been there, not necessarily during the session on bills, but advocacy, trying to bring awareness that it is not fully funding special ed. And that means that those dollars that are, because they have to pay for special ed, so it's actually coming out of the general education budget to be able to pay for that. So it's shortchanging everyone.
So there hasn't really been a bill to increase the funding for special education. It should be part of our K-12 budget. Part of my objection with the K-12 budget committee in the House being the sole, operator of our K-12 budget was that we didn't really have hearings on the budget. We had a one-day informational hearing upon the State Department's, enhancement requests and a one-day hearing on the governor's recommendations. And then that was kind of it. And they weren't even necessarily, it wasn't even a bill at that point in time. So there weren't proponents and opponents. It was just informational. Are the people showing up? Yes, they're showing up. The governor's State of the State address, a Shawnee Mission student was recognized during the address that would qualify for an IEP. The Kansas City Star covered a family with a first grader, I want to say. There was an op-ed written. People are definitely showing up. And then advocacy days, people are there. When we were working Senate Bill 83 on the floor that had the special education piece in it, there were teachers in the gallery. People are showing up when we give them the opportunity to show up. I don't think they've had the opportunity to show up specifically for a bill. And I personally, I think that's unfair. Back to the underfunding issue, without special education being funded to the 92%, I don't think we can say that our classrooms are still fully funded. When I heard the $72 million, year over year last year, that seemed like such a large number to me. And then when I got together with our with our Johnson County superintendents, over 45 million of that 72 million, I want to say, comes right here to Johnson County. Last year, I think SMSD was at 8.2 million underfunded for special education excess cost. I want to say Blue Valley was 16 or 18 million. But if you totaled up the 6 districts in Johnson County, well over 50% of that underfunding is due right here. So, and I think that's a really frustrating part when they play games with this, because they're just not doing what's right. They're playing games with it, and it's hurting all students, So instead of the education savings account being a solution, we could actually try to just do our job. But, that's a far out concept some days in Topeka.
I actually want to take my time to commend Representative Ousley on all of his work on this issue. He's a large reason that this issue has been elevated to the level that it has in the House. He almost successfully got an amendment to the budget last year to fully fund special education. And I think, was it 2 years ago? Or the last 2 years, you said?
22 minutes we had.
Oh, yes. Yes. So anyways, I really wanted to thank him. We're closer than ever to getting this done because of his really good advocacy work. So I wanted to say thank you.
No clapping. While I appreciate each of your voting records against the anti-trans bills, I remain concerned as long as they exist. What are you doing to stop these altogether?
I have been a very vocal advocate for our trans communities because I think they have a space in this state and we need diversity. You can see what Michigan is doing and trying to get everyone to move to Michigan because they were saying we're accepting. But the governor did veto this bill, and it's one of many that we have. We have a hearing in Senate Education on yet another trans bill this week. Part of this is in Wichita, I believe it was in 2020, there was a student who was LGBTQ and was fighting with her parents at the time, went to lunch, came back, and the student hung themselves in the bathroom and killed herself. The community said, we need to do something about this. We need training. We need to know what is happening. We need to know how to talk about these issues. And so they put together a plan talking about national statistics on suicide rates, ways to have open conversation. Parents they sign all of this. They've actually had 2 people since this was implemented. So over the last 3 years that have filled these papers out, and we are attacking them. So if you look at CPAC a couple of weeks ago, the conversation was we want to eradicate this group of people, and they're marginalized. We need to try to understand them, and I will always support for them because they are loved. There is a place for them, and discrimination does not belong in our state.
I think the question is, how do we stop these anti-trans bills? It kind of goes along the same line. How do we stop these voucher bills? How do we stop anti-reproductive health care bills? How do we stop gun violence? We got to get some more people elected, different people, because we're a super minority right here. And I will say fairly confidently, I believe we are in line with the views of the people. We support Medicaid expansion. We support reducing gun violence. We support reproductive health care. We are against these anti-trans bills, and we're against vouchers. But again, we're a super minority. And I tell people often, I'm like, envision the wall here like this is a dam, and there's all these little holes. We only have so many hands to push back and stop those holes. And it is difficult in our position, the respect that there are so many bad bills coming forward every session that we have to push back against. And I know a couple weeks ago, somebody said to me, well, when are you all going to get to the good stuff? It's hard to. it's hard to get to the good bills when they're, like I said, we're pretty consistently on defense mode. Interestingly, I don't know that a lot of people realize this, but I think we have had 6 abortion bills at least introduced into the Healthcare Committee to do away with abortion, change the rules, etc. I think the general public just believes we decided that in August. But yet, if we keep sending the same group of extremists back to Topeka, we're going to keep seeing those same bills. So that's essentially where we are. And I will tell you this, I know I wholeheartedly appreciate the messages of support that I get from you all, that we all get, encouraging us to stay in there, because there are some days it can be kind of disheartening when all you're doing is pushing back against some really bad bills.
Thank you. I would add to that, just your advocacy is super important. I think in addition to electing people who believe in LGBTQ rights and the humanity and dignity of every single person and their right to participate in sports and receive gender affirming care and to be in public spaces that, align with their gender identity and sexual orientation. In addition to that, your advocacy and holding the legislators who don't believe in these things accountable is extremely important. When we're on committee and we hear these bills, to have people from the community say, this is how this impacts me, this is how this harms my community, that is incredibly powerful. And I think that's part of what we have to keep doing too, is to make sure that the people who are proponents of these bills know how this really impacts Kansans, and to hold them accountable for that. And I think having members of the LGBTQ community who are now in the House of Representatives, I think we have 4 members now, has been incredibly powerful. They've been able to go on the floor and, basically say, you're doing this to our community and you have to look us in the eyes while you take this vote. And I think that direct representation matters, the representation of people who believe in gay rights matters, and your advocacy matters. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
So to continue on that, we lost the T of our LBGT caucus last year. We had a trans woman, Stephanie Byers, that was a representative out of the Wichita area that could not seek re-election due to family history. That combined with losing the executive director for Equality Kansas, who had been there, I want to say since 2001 or 2003, Thomas Witt was his name, who also had to resign due to family issues. So we lost 2 tremendous advocates in the State House who would really track legislation and who knew the impacts of the legislation personally. So I think that that's a detriment to why we're seeing this issue come up again. So as a representative, all I can do is, try to educate and advocate the best that I can to members to make sure that they fully understand not only the impact, but then the process. I've got a copy of the Acacia policy sitting on my desk to take to one of my colleagues before this vote comes up, because I want them to understand that this is nothing but hatred. We don't need it. And I'm happy the governor mentioned the Acacia policy in her veto, because if you read that policy, it's inclusive. It's not exclusive. We know that children's sports are good for mental health. They're good for social skills. It's far beyond athleticism. And I think that as a legislature, we should be focusing upon that.
What is your opinion of the bills that were introduced related to the Shawnee Indian Mission locations?
So I can take that since I'm the senator who represents the Shawnee Indian Mission. So those bills didn't move forward. I think that ultimately what we need is we need to have everybody come together and have everybody around the table. And I think it needs to be a really big inclusive table. I think we need to have, there was not just, the proposal was to transfer, for those who don't know, let me back up. The proposal was that we would transfer the Shawnee Mission Indian site, which is both a national and state historical site, to one particular tribe. During the time that the site was a mission, there were 22 different tribes who had children there. So I had a lot of hesitation about transferring it to one particular tribe. I think that we want to have all of the different tribes at the table who had children at that mission. And I think we want to work together with the State Historical Society, with the City of Fairway, with national partners, and with the tribes to make sure that the story that we're telling and that we're reflecting at the mission is inclusive, is comprehensive, is talking about the very complicated, very real history of the mission. I don't think that we want to whitewash anything or not tell a complete story, but I did have some hesitation about giving it to one particular tribe that's not actually even located in the state of Kansas. They're actually Miami, Oklahoma. So I think that we need to bring everybody together, work towards having a solution where everybody has a voice, the story's told in a full, complete, accurate way. So that's what I've encouraged all parties to do from the very beginning. I'm a little bit hopeful that now, because the bill did not move forward, there's a little bit more impetus for that to take place, and we can actually have that conversation. And so that's what my hope is, that we can have happen in our community.
Just to add to that too, the Senate will be confirming the new head of the Historical Society, because there was kind of a change in that. So I think, trying to bring everyone to the table, and then new leadership from the Historical Society can help move that forward.
And I know this topic's important to folks in the crowd. I had a brief discussion ahead of time. It's my understanding that the new chair of House, Fed, and State is not going to have a hearing on this bill this year, so I do believe that the conversation will not happen on the House side at the earliest until next year.
I may be in favor of raising the pay to reps and senators of Kansas, but I don't know what they currently earn. Where can I find their salaries?
Yeah, I can take that. Thank you for the question. So we do have a really complicated pay scale, and I don't know where online. I can try and find that information and share it. I can just share. I mean, I don't have any problems personally sharing my salary. I think for me, and it kind of depends on your CAPERS contribution, your the level of insurance you have, et cetera. My take home is about $16,000 a year. So, and that's before, gas money. We get paid mileage once a week, so you get one round trip of mileage, but I commute every single day, so it doesn't necessarily cover that. And then, there's no cost of living adjustment or anything like that. And that's I think most of us, or some of us who are working age, we still work, the rest of the year. So for my first session, I had another full-time job. And then last year, for example, I had an independent contract and also worked seasonal retail in order to be able to afford to do this. So it's, I think we all want to work in our community as well. I think it's important to find a compromise on what's livable for people who are young and for people who are working and come from underrepresented backgrounds, to make sure that our people's house represents the people, because right now it doesn't. And the majority of folks who are in the legislature are retired or independently wealthy. And I think a lot of those folks have the wisdom that comes with age, but I think it's really important that our state house represents the people of Kansas, and that's not reflected right now. So I think this is one way that we can incentivize more people more diverse people to run for office. I know it has been a barrier for a lot of people who have considered it in the past. And so this will hopefully be a way to get an independent opinion about how does our legislative salary compare to surrounding states, and then do we think that's appropriate to implement? So kind of a first step in addressing that broader issue.
So also so we get paid $88 a day. That's our salary while we're in session. So that's for basically 90 days. We get $88 a day. We do get a per diem, which that is tied to the federal. So I believe, is it 152 right now? I think it's about 150 a day. So if we are in Topeka, and that pays for a lot of our colleagues rent places in Topeka, so that's where that goes to. But again, a lot of our colleagues, because if they take advantage of healthcare through the state, they actually write a check to the state back at the end of the year.
Husband often jokes that his return on investment on me has gone down substantially. So I worked at Sprint for several years, had a great job there, then took a few years off to raise children, stay home, and then when it was time to go back to work, I ended up running for office. Essentially, we kind of go into the red, so to speak, at different points based upon where we were. The only reason I've been able to do it is because while I was working, I put a decent amount of money away as far as my own rainy day fund, and that has kind of subsidized us throughout this time period, because going from 2 incomes to 1 for that long of a period has a pretty big impact. And so, yeah, it means that a number of people just can't even consider running for office. Plus, you have to take into consideration, I mean, who really wants to hire somebody for half the year? I mean, our schedule is not conducive to other employment. So that's an issue. I mean, and so it does feel like the whole system and the whole situation on our legislative pay is stacked so that, you know, it allows people who are retired and wealthy to be the dominant force in the state house. And that's an issue. I'm 53 and I'm considered, quote, one of the younger ones. That's a problem. So we need to fix this.
A part-time legislature, but to do this job, it is a full-time job. And I know all of my colleagues up here, we answer our emails, we read those year long, but there are members who they just have an auto reply saying, we're not in session. I'll get back to you in January if they get back to you.
One other thing I'll add to that we don't often talk about, we don't actually really have any staff. So I think that's kind of sometimes a misconception where we have someone who's helping us year-round with constituent services or emails or anything like that, and we share an assistant during session. So we either get 1/4 of an assistant or 1/2 of an assistant, more or less, depending on your situation. Senators are lucky in that they get 1 assistant each. So they help with our scheduling during session and some of our emails, but for the most part, we do all of our own constituent services and outreach. And I think we all take that job very seriously year-round and want to make sure we do a good job. On top of the additional advocacy and committee work we do, for example, I'm really involved with water issues in the state of Kansas, and I travel all across the state when we're not in session talking to producers and advocates about what we want to do to ensure the availability of that resource. So we're definitely working year-round really hard to make sure that we're doing a good job, and our work doesn't stop with session.
2 cents. When I was recruited to run for office, they jokingly told me the only thing about this, it's part-time, is the pay. That's not really a joke so much at all. But prior to being a legislator, I was a house painter. And when I was doing estimates, for contracting, I'd remind folks, often you get what you pay for. So there's that to keep in mind as well.
Well, and interestingly, to kind of expound upon what Representative Vaughn was saying, we don't have staff, and during that off session, it's all us, answering our own emails and responding and trying to get answers for people. Additionally, I think people often assume we have a lot larger, not just staff, but just operation behind us. I mean, I'll have people say to me, well, I'll meet you in your office in your district on Saturday morning. I'm like, okay, I'll be seeing you in my dining room. Awesome. So we don't have all of these facilities and staff that often people think we do.
So we are at time. So I'm sorry to cut us off before we get to all of our questions. However, in your chairs, like I said before, there are the follow-up sheets. You can call, you can email, or, grab. I hate to get you guys trapped, but you can grab them right now at the end of this session. So thank you so much. I believe we still have donuts and coffee. We still have donuts and coffee. Grab one on your way out. When you're doing your civic duty, you deserve a donut. So thank you so much.